Hey guys, this is part 2 of our series on intermittent fasting, and today we're going to talk about kind of the results from uses and experiments of intermittent fasting among the people with medical conditions. If you didn't hear part 1, it was on essentially the cellular response of your cells. Now we'll go over it a little bit in this part, so you don't necessarily need to go back and listen to part 1, but it's only about 8 minutes long. I recommend you do it just so you understand how the intracellular response works, right? And there's real science, real cellular change going on when you're doing this type of diet, which is not universal for all types of diets. You don't necessarily go through a biological change just because you're dieting, but this one has actual molecular adaptation and things like that. And we'll go over a little bit in this one. I recommend part 1, but like I said, part 2, you can pick up here and be fine. All right, guys, let's get into it. Hey guys, thanks for checking out Quick Session. I'm your host, Garrett Terrio, coming to you from Houston, Texas, inside Timberline Fitness Studio. And today we're going to be talking about the effects of intermittent fasting through clinical trials, different types of diseases, the states at which it is effective and has helped people come out of said states. So to start off with a little more history, in case you missed the first one, our bodies have always been good at adapting as human beings since the earliest days of whenever you think that actually begun. And through intermittent fasting, which our ancestors definitely did, right? Hunters, gatherers, you didn't just have 3 meals a day. You tracked your food, you had a big feast, you go about it. You could be extremely fasted, right? You can go days without food and your body adapts to it for survival. Now, we don't need it for survival anymore, but we still have the same biology as those ancestors internally at a cellular level. So they are built to adapt. And the great thing that intermittent fasting does is it really does show that most, if not all, of your organ systems respond very well to it. And that is the repeated exposure, right, to the fasting period. So we're not talking about 2 or 3 days. We're talking about if you just fasted for a period every single day. And this repeated exposure shows a lasting adaptive response, right? So the idea is that if you fast periodically enough times in a row, I don't have an exact number of it. Every experiment's a little different. Some people do 45 days, 60 days, 90 days. It all depends. And even in this, the New England Journal of Medicine article review, which we're getting all our information from, they even have different time frames for all of their experiments. But the thing they have in common is that the cells in your body respond to intermittent fasting, and they really engage in like a coordinated adaptation to this stress, the stress of not having food readily available at all times. And it is good that they all coordinate because now the whole body can bring out the defense systems, the antioxidant defense, the repair of your tissues and bones and all that kind of things, the use of quality protein, and of course my favorite, we'll call it the down regulation of inflammation. So when these responses all happen, it allows the cells to remove all that damaged protein and cellular junk that have been broken down, and at the same time it's doing this, it's actually reusing the healthy molecules. So your own body is using what it has in it already to try and heal itself. Okay, and this is, we talked a little bit about it in the first podcast, but essentially this oxidative damage is just a constant wear and tear in your body. It's a biological breakdown of your body. That's the best way to put it. And it happens from now until the end of time. And the idea is if you could slow that down, it would help elongate your life, right? Extend your life. So the first study we're going with, and most of this is rat studies, but we have a couple more which surprised me and may surprise you. But the first one's in rats, right? The earliest studies of the intermittent fasting idea were in rats. And, some of the rat life increased 80%, right? And rats don't live that long, 1.5 2 years. We're talking about rats living, 3.5, 4 years now because of what they did in this experiment was alternate day feeding. Now, it sounds like a little much for humans, especially physically active humans. That's kind of one of the things where the studies haven't quite caught up because it's a relatively new idea as far as life extension. But it wouldn't surprise me eventually to do these studies and it's like, yeah, just eat every other day. That's the best way to live forever. Now, most people won't get on board with that because of either lifestyle or just they're too active and they need even more fuel, because even though your body can repair itself, it still needs outside nutrients if you are a runner or a person that lifts weights every day, something like that. But the reason some of these studies don't come to light as big news is because there's other factors, right? You have your sex, the diet, the age, the genetic factors of all these mice. And we don't have a mouse lineage I guess we'd call it. I don't know, but you can't go back and see if the mouse had a history of cancer or if the female rats live longer than the male rats on average in all the labs, right? I'm not sure that's something that's widely tracked, especially in the past. Maybe nowadays it is. But regardless of all that, from the analysis that they could gather, it looked like about the median lifespan was, between 14 and 45% is the numbers it has in here. Once again, it's the New England Journal of Medicine. And that was in rats, right? A little bit bigger. In the mice, it was only up to 27%. So it is a little tricky. But at the same time, it's a whole different animal, essentially. And the rats, they're bigger, so they tend to live longer anyway. But even with the calorie-restrictive diet between the two rodents, the bigger ones living a lot longer. That just could be it, right? So it could be kind of like a multiple effect. So if, the small animal is going to live 25% longer with calorie restriction, a little bit bigger will live 50% longer. What happens when someone as big as a human does alternative day feeding, right? And we haven't studied someone over their life. That's kind of the next step is, 50 years of research and testing. And then even at that point, it'd be tough. You want to see how long they actually live, but maybe there's a cellular age test you can do to see how much slower they're actually aging. It's always a possibility. By the time they have that figured out, this podcast will probably not exist anymore. Maybe it'll be archived. Who knows? Anyway, they did have a couple landmark studies, more than just the mice. They did it with monkeys also, in order to try to figure out if there's a link with the monkeys, and hopefully we could translate that into human, maybe not evidence, but guesses, estimates, things like that. And while these two studies on monkeys showed, positive effects from the caloric restrictions on the health and survival, there's so many other factors. They had a hard time saying this is the reason the monkey's living longer. But one thing that was universal is that they were all in better health. So from whatever testing was going on, it seemed like the calorie restriction was a big factor into it. Now, in humans, they've started some trials, okay? And in one trial, from what I'm reading, I'm going to read this pretty much word for word. 16 healthy participants were assigned to a regimen of alternative day fasting for 22 days. And they lost 2.5% of their initial weight and 4% of fat mass, with a 57% decrease in fasting insulin levels. Now, that's the one, I think that's the most important part. Yeah, it's great they lost fat mass and lost overall weight. The fact that their fasting insulin levels were so much lower means that they're utilizing energy better, number one. Number two, they're not going to be as sensitive to storing the bad crap, right? If you're extremely insulin sensitive, then your body's going to it's going to spike with insulin when you eat, number one. Your body's going to store a lot, and you're also going to eat more. And maybe it comes down to a discipline thing at that point, but it can always be very challenging when your body says it needs something or wants something. It can be hard to deny, right? And of course you can, but one of the things that, look, across the board, if everybody could just say no, we wouldn't even need gyms, right? I mean, I guess for weightlifting, but, the running parks would be light. So the fact that you can really decrease the fasting insulin levels is a huge deal for things like suppressing hunger, maintaining energy with less food in your system, amongst other things. But those are probably the two biggest ones I would think most people would care about on a day-to-day basis, right? So it's, to sum it up, and I was kind of rambling on there, so I think I misspoke a little bit. You want lower fasting insulin levels, right? And with that, you have higher insulin sensitivity. So you get fuller quicker, right? So if you have higher resting levels, you'll be hungrier, you think you'll need more because your body uses that insulin to try to grow, you hold weight, things like that. Some of those, I think I misspoke earlier, but anyway, that cleared it up. Now, one thing they do in all these experiments, too, is they also have the control group, correct? They got someone who just did simply a calorie-restrictive diet, 25, 30% less calories than normal, and they control the food and they eat throughout the day. Now, they lost the same amount of weight as the people that did a 5 days on, 2 days off fasting in the human experiment. And keep in mind, it's 16 people, right? There's thousands of different type of body types that all respond differently to different diets. But the difference was internally, right? The insulin levels, were much better for those that did the fasting other than the constant feeding. Because if you're constantly eating, your insulin's always ready to spike. It's, if you've ever done something where you eat every 3 hours, a lot of bodybuilders eat like that. A lot of regular people eat like that. So if you're doing breakfast, snack, if you do that for a while and then you get to a point where you go 4 or 5 hours without food, you'll start getting lightheaded and all that. And that's your body just begging you, you start getting lightheaded and things like that, that's where insulin sensitivity comes in. So when the levels, stumbling all over myself. So when you have lower fasting insulin levels, you're not always as starving, is the point. Whereas you're constantly eating, your insulin levels are constantly getting fed. And so the minute you're not fed, your insulin drops and it's hard to get it back up to feel good. And that's when people tend to overeat. I hope all that made sense. I know I was kind of jumping back and forth and rambling a little bit, but hopefully you got something out of it. Anyway, in an effort to sum it up in a more eloquent way, there's plenty of trials going on. Plenty of good results are coming from it. It's being used to fight obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer even. It's shown to reduce growth of tumors when it comes to cancer, neurodegenerative disorders, asthma, multiple sclerosis, arthritis, surgically repaired tissue injuries. All this kind of stuff has been used to reduce these kinds of conditions and diseases. And it's because a lot of what our body needs to heal comes from food. And it's dependent on food, but it also, when it depends on something and it's manipulated by something, sometimes it can get out of whack, right? And the ultimate cure to everything is cellular adaptation, right? You're working out, you're getting stronger. That's cellular adaptation. So it makes sense that it would be the same thing when it comes to gaining and losing weight. And with this period of fasting, putting your body through this stress, which we know lifting weights, you got to stress your body to get bigger and stronger and better. If you're running, you got to stress it to get better cardiovascular endurance and just be healthier in general. Our bodies are made to be stressed. They want to be stressed at all times, with rest in between, of course. So I don't literally mean around the clock, but I have a thing about doing something every day. I think it's extremely important because it's just inherently what we need and what our bodies are used to, and the way our cells have adapted since 10,000 BC is to go through periods of stress and adjust as such. So, the fact that fasting, while it can seem like torture, it does so many good things. It improves the insulin sensitivity. It can, reverse fat store, having too much fat, holding too much body fat. It can help reverse those effects. There's studies that because you can reuse your current molecules to get a better repair session going, right? Instead of just the oxidative breakdown of all your cells, which ultimately leads to our death and organ failure and things like that. If we can delay that a little bit. I don't know about you, I've never met an overweight 100-year-old, so I'm willing to bet that does have a big play in it, right? It's a big factor in it. And other things we didn't even touch on, like it's great for your blood pressure, right? It helps your resting heart rate, controls your triglyceride count, glucose, insulin. Talk to insulin a bunch. And of course, my favorite being the inflammation that it keeps down, because your body is not busy processing all this food. Your digestive system gets a break. And I know I'm going on right now sounding like I'm just championing this style of eating, but with all the evidence piling up and only more intense studies are coming, it's hard to ignore. Now, one thing I'll be very clear about, and I'll be more into the real life stuff on part 3 of the podcast, but it doesn't mean just eat everything you want when you're not fasting. You still need to make healthy choices, right? There's not like a big payoff where, okay, if I just starve myself for a while, then I could eat whatever I want. You don't want that either, because you're already stressing your body with the lack of food. Overloading doesn't help. It sends it to the whole other side of the spectrum. So definitely be careful with that. If anybody ever tells you eat whatever you want between 12 and 8 or something like that, they're full of shit. Don't believe them. You can send them to me and I'll set them straight. I don't know. But moral of the story, don't believe them. Anyway, guys, I know that was a little long and rambly. I hope you learned something. I hope you stuck with me. But it's something that, diets, what you eat is different every day pretty much for most people. So I guess the podcast kind of followed that suit. Anyway, I hope you stuck around. If you have not, please visit the Apple Pod Center, rate, review. It really helps the podcast. 5 stars, please. If you didn't like it, please just mind your own business. Follow us on Instagram, Quick Sessions Podcast. Also, a new website up, Garrett Terrio Health. This will involve, not just podcast stuff, more training videos, tutorials, what's going on around the gym here in Houston, Texas. If you're into any of that, check out Garrett Terrio Health on Instagram. Also, GarrettTerrioHealth.com. Thanks again, guys. See you next time.